Hey everybody, welcome to this week's teaching video. Today we're going to focus on counterarguments. So let's get to it. Do you ever have that experience where you're looking through the text that we're writing a paper on and you find a bunch of evidence that supports your claim, enough for every paragraph, but you also find some evidence that seems pretty relevant to the text and pretty important that seems to completely say the opposite of your claim and might disprove it? What do you do with that? Do you just ignore it? Well, if you do, then your paper, risks feeling a bit disconnected. A good example of this is this meme where the dog says, "This is fine." If you look around the room, it's not fine. There's fire and smoke, and those are evidence of it not being fine. So the claim that this is fine is not a convincing claim, and that's where the comedy comes from. But you don't really want your paper to sound like that. You want it to sound much more salient and relevant and grounded in the text than this claim is grounded in this situation. So there's a term for this. It's called cherry picking. Cherry picking your evidence means looking through the text and picking up on all of the things that support your claim, but kind of ignoring or not acknowledging the things that suggest otherwise, or directly are at odds with your point. Readers find a cherry-picked paper unconvincing because these unaddressed pieces of evidence, especially if they're particularly significant to the plot or the narrative structure or whatever you're making your claim about, if they're particularly important, then they kind of make your paper look like it's got these holes or gaps in it, and you don't really want that to be happening. Okay, well, if you can't cherry pick, what are you supposed to do with all of this evidence that doesn't really fit your claim and sometimes actually, seems totally contrary to it? That's where counterarguments come in. What's a counterargument? Counterarguments acknowledge evidence that appears to contradict your claim or other potential interpretations of the evidence that you're using. So say you use a piece of evidence that's really ambiguous and you have one specific interpretation of it that you really think is the right one. That's well and good, but a reader might come in with a totally different one and think, okay, I could see it being that way, but I'm not convinced that my way of seeing it is wrong. So one thing you could do is acknowledge that the evidence is ambivalent or ambiguous and explain why you think your reading is the right one. That acknowledges those other potential readings and sort of presents a reason why yours is the best one or why yours is the most pertinent. Counterarguments can go in many places in your paper, and they can take many forms. They can be useful in the body of the paper, and they can also be useful in the introduction. First, we'll talk about the introduction because it comes first. Note before we start, don't include evidence in your introduction. Sometimes that's a thing that you want to do in much higher level papers where you're writing something as a response to or in argument with other papers. Then you might want to reference those to sort of ground it in scholarly discourse. But that's something you do more at in upper level humanities courses. For a paper like this, we really want to hear your voice. So the introduction should be you telling us about your argument, not you making your argument yet. That being said, it can be particularly convincing to include a counterargument in your introduction. In fact, that's something that we've already been doing. The stasis is a counterargument. You are presenting one way of seeing things and then pushing back against it, showing the problems created by that viewpoint or not addressed by that viewpoint, and then giving your own answer to that problem, solving that problem with your argument. Your argument looks and feels stronger because it is put against this counterargument. It sets it up to be convincing and to feel like you've given it good thought because you've not only considered your side, you've considered the alternative, and it's part of why you're so convinced by your side. So that's how you can use them in the introduction. You can also use them in your body paragraphs. Well, if you do that, will it make your claims weaker? No. Much like it makes your introduction stronger to have the counter argument of the stasis, it makes your claims stronger if you acknowledge the obvious counterargument, because if you don't acknowledge it, your reader will, and we want you to meet your reader where they are. I think we've all had that experience of reading a paper where you're like, like I disagree here and I want to push back on that claim because I'm not really convinced, because, when we read books, it's natural to want to think our ideas about the books are right. So if we're reading a paper that totally disagrees with how we read something, then, we're going to want to see how that writer anticipates and addresses our concerns and our potential counterarguments for their claim. So if you meet the reader where they are, you'll have a much easier time of bringing them over to your side. And there are a couple ways you can do this. One way is to present the counterarguments and push back against them, show why they're wrong. And there are two ways to do that. One, literally just show why they're wrong. Say, Penelope is a bad hostess. And I know you might think that she's a good hostess because she's letting all of these suitors, stay and she's not kicking them out. But, and then, you could present an argument about how by not looking after her household, she's potentially harming future travelers who might come and be looking for a place to stay. And if she has nothing left to give them, is she doing Xenia correctly? I mean, that's a weird claim that I made up on the spot, but the point is that you can literally give a counterexample and then push back on it and show why it's wrong and reiterate why you're right. That's one way to address counter arguments. Another is to include the exception that proves the rule. There was a really good example of this in the papers that you guys just turned in. Somebody wrote a paper about women and travel and argued that women in the Odyssey can't travel and they're tied to place, and presented Athena as a counter example, and then showed how she's actually the exception that proves the rule, because it's only through her godly power that she has the ability to travel. So that's a great use of a counter argument to be the exception that proves the rule. And there's a third option, which is counter arguments can actually be a source for complexity and nuance in your main claim if you consider them not just in the body of your paragraph as something to push back on, but in fact something to inform your argument from the beginning, rather than presenting, a very simplified vision of, say, what gender looks like in the Odyssey by saying the women have no power. You could present a nuanced argument about how the women have maybe less overt power than the men, but in other forms of power, they have, control over the house to some extent. They have, this weird sexual power dynamic going on. There's, that's also, a weird claim I made up on the spot, but my point is that you can use the counter argument to develop your claim even further from your first initial simplified claim. You can make a more complex, complete claim about the significance of one particular aspect of a text by considering the counter arguments to your initial intended claim. This brings us to another important point. We don't want your claims to be too simple. So we don't want a really simplified, broad, generalized statement about, hospitality is good and being a bad host is bad. That doesn't really add anything to the reader's interpretation, and it doesn't really elucidate your interpretation. But we don't want a too convoluted claim either. Complexity is not convolution. So we don't want an overly simplified claim, but we also don't want a claim that has 6 different subparts that tangentially relate to each other. It's a really hard balance to find. And it's one of the biggest challenges of writing shorter essays like the ones that you write in this class, because if you have a long paper, then you have time to make this really complicated claim and, give each step its due course and its space. But in a 3 to 4 page paper, or even a 5 to 7 page paper, there's only so much space you have. So you really have to find a claim that is complex enough to be nuanced and meaningful, but simple enough that you can tie all the threads together within the allotted space. And that's the real challenge of this class. So we're going to roast some of my writing again. This is from my undergraduate sort of thesis thing, I guess. It's kind of funny because we talked about if on a winter's night a traveler very briefly in class today. Anyway, give this, pause and come back in a minute. Welcome back. So this is an example of a too complex claim. It's convoluted and not very clear. I didn't develop these ideas in a way that shows how I thought they related. And that's the big thing, what works for one writer might not work for another. I know people who could write an essay like the one I was trying to write here and do it well. I'm sure I do, but I didn't, because I didn't really figure out exactly what I meant in time. So these ideas, I talk a lot about reading, life, writing, and death. And I also talk about multiplicity and individuality, but I don't really connect those ideas. I mean, I try to here by saying something about the specifics of individual narratives as opposed to like the multiplicity of narrative, but the connection is tenuous and it's vague. And I think I could have done a much better, clearer, more succinct and simpler job of expressing why I thought it was important that these things, be intertwined in this fashion, and why I thought these ideas were worth discussing together. Ultimately, you have to convince your reader that the ideas you're combining need to be combined in that way, or are meaningful when combined in that way. Otherwise, your paper can sort of feel like an arbitrary paper. And I think that the way I wrote this paragraph, I would not write it this way if I were to write it again today. I would definitely work a lot on clarifying the relationship between individuality and multiplicity and narrative and death, because without that, it seems like two papers, one on individuality and multiplicity in death or in narrative, and one on death and narrative as interrelated concepts. So ultimately, if you're struggling to link a couple of different diverse ideas that seem related, but you can't quite fit the puzzle pieces together, that might mean it's not the time for you to address those ideas together, and maybe it'd be better to focus on one in particular. Here's another example. This one's shorter. Take a minute, read it over, and then come back. All right, so this one is simpler and clearer because it is simpler. It's about the trial, and the class assignment was to write one paper arguing one thing, and then write a second paper that was solely counter-arguing your first paper, and then combine them, which was such a fun assignment because it really got you thinking about the importance of counter-argument and how it can really add to the nuance of a claim. And so your claim can not only be against a counter-argument, but actually built on one. And that adds this really interesting degree of complexity and completeness to your claim that gives you, a lot more to say about the text. The caveat being, if you build a counter-argument into your claim, then you don't want that counter-argument to be your stasis. Unless your stasis, it does give you a new opportunity, which is to use a simple claim as your stasis. And then say, but actually, more nuanced claim. But that's a little hard. So you don't have to do that. Especially because you kind of want your stasis to be like, it'd have to be a very simple claim to make that work, because you don't want your stasis to be something that requires argument, or else your reader won't accept it. And then that sets things off weirdly. Anyway, so I thought this was a fair enough example of a claim that includes sort of like a simple complexity, because it's arguing against a straightforward reading of guilt as having this like one meaning, and instead arguing that, that everyone in the novel has guilt as well, as Joseph K., the main character. And so you'd sort of take a concept that appears one way and explore how it can actually have greater valence when you sort of like look at the evidence to the contrary of what you're led to believe. And so that's sort of an example of a counter-argument, and also an example of a claim that is, fairly simple, but not too simple. That's all for today, in terms of this week, things are different because of the optional drafts. So you don't have to turn in a draft if you don't have the time or don't feel like it's particularly important to your writing process. That's valid, and you don't have to turn in a draft. I won't be offended. I will say, if you like feedback, turn in a draft. I'll give you feedback. But if you don't have time to turn in a draft, or for whatever reason you don't, and then you decide you want feedback later, that's totally cool, and I will understand. So you can just shoot me an email, send me a draft, ask for feedback, ask for office hours. Always happy to meet, always happy to look at things, regardless of whether or not you turn in an optional draft. But because of the optional drafts, I'm not sure exactly how many drafts we'll actually be workshopping. We'll workshop what comes in, and I will have a lot planned for the rest of the time, which is this week. Instead of focusing on one or two particular concepts, we're going to talk about a number of bad writing habits that everybody falls into every once in a while, and how to address them if you find yourself doing them. And then we'll also talk a bit about citation and MLA formatting. Until then, happy writing, stay healthy, stay safe, stay warm. See ya.